In the 18th century, Havana was not simply a Caribbean city, it was an instrument of empire. The harbor curved inward like a natural fortress, narrow at its entrance and widening into a protected basin. From the sea, approaching ships would first see stone rising from rock, defensive walls facing outward. Beyond them lay one of the most important logistical nodes in the Atlantic world. If you value historical reconstructions grounded in documented structures, places where geography and power intersected, consider subscribing. This channel explores how cities functioned within larger systems, without dramatization, without invention, only layered historical reality. Havana's rise was not accidental. Spain's American empire depended on silver, primarily extracted from mines in places like Potosi in present-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in New Spain. That silver moved overland to ports such as Veracruz and Cartagena, where it joined transatlantic convoys known as the flota system. The fleet system emerged in the 16th century as a defensive solution against piracy and rival European powers. Instead of allowing ships to travel independently, Spain organized annual or semi-annual convoys escorted by armed vessels. These fleets would gather in Havana before crossing the Atlantic. By the early 1700s, this system had matured into a complex maritime choreography. Ships arrived from the Gulf of Mexico carrying silver and goods. They waited in Havana's harbor for favorable winds and sufficient naval protection. During these weeks, the harbor would fill with masts, rigging, and hulls, resting low in the water under the weight of cargo. Havana functioned as an assembly point, but also as a repair station. Hulls damaged by tropical storms were reinforced in its shipyards. Fresh water, food, and supplies were loaded. Crews were reorganized. Naval officers inspected cargo and verified documentation. Bureaucracy was inseparable from maritime activity. The city itself mirrored this structured rhythm. Built on a grid typical of Spanish colonial planning, Havana centered around plazas and administrative buildings. The cathedral, government offices, warehouses, and barracks formed an urban core designed not for ornament, but for control. Yet the harbor's importance made it vulnerable. Throughout the 17th century, Havana had faced repeated threats from pirates and foreign navies. By the 18th century, Spain recognized that defending this harbor meant defending its imperial lifeline. The Castillo de los Tres Reyes del Moro guarded the entrance from elevated ground. Across the channel stood La Punta. Cannons were positioned to create intersecting lines of fire across the narrow passage. Despite these defenses, global conflicts reached the Caribbean. The War of the Spanish Succession at the beginning of the century disrupted trade routes. Later, the War of Jenkins' Ear and broader European rivalries intensified maritime competition. Havana was never isolated from these conflicts. It was embedded within them. But the most consequential event of the century occurred in 1762. During the 7 Years' War, Britain launched an ambitious campaign against Spanish holdings. Recognizing Havana's strategic value, British forces mounted a large-scale expedition. They landed east of the city and advanced toward the Moro castle. The siege lasted weeks. Tropical heat and disease complicated operations on both sides. When British artillery gained a position overlooking the Moro, sustained bombardment weakened Spanish defenses. The fall of the castle effectively opened the harbor. Havana surrendered in August 1762. For less than a year, the city operated under British occupation. Trade restrictions were loosened. British merchants entered the harbor. Goods flowed with fewer bureaucratic constraints. In that brief period, Havana experienced a surge in commercial exchange that revealed what a less restrictive system might look like. However, the Treaty of Paris in 1763 returned Havana to Spain in exchange for Florida. the Spanish crown drew a clear lesson from the occupation. The harbor must never be so vulnerable again. In response, Spain invested heavily in fortification. The Fortaleza de San Carlos de la Cabaña was constructed on the heights east of the harbor, one of the largest colonial fortresses in the Americas. Its scale was deliberate. Its position ensured that no attacking force could easily dominate the entrance again. By the late 18th century, Havana had become one of the most fortified cities in the New World. But fortifications were only part of the story. The plantation economy of Cuba expanded significantly during this period. Sugar production intensified, especially after the Haitian Revolution disrupted French Caribbean plantations. As Saint-Domingue's output declined, Cuba filled the vacuum. This shift dramatically increased the volume of exports moving through Havana. Sugar required labor. The transatlantic slave trade expanded accordingly. Enslaved Africans were transported to Cuba in increasing numbers to work on plantations. The demographic composition of the island shifted. Havana became not only a transit hub for silver, but a central port in a plantation economy tied to global consumption. This transformation altered the city's internal dynamics. Warehouses stored sugar and tobacco alongside imported European goods. Merchants negotiated prices influenced by distant markets in Madrid and London. Insurance, credit, and maritime finance became integral to daily operations. Meanwhile, Spain implemented the Bourbon reforms, administrative changes intended to increase efficiency and revenue across the empire. These reforms centralized authority, reduced corruption, and tightened economic regulation. Havana's role was formalized within this system. Customs enforcement strengthened. Military presence expanded. The harbor became not simply a place of assembly, but a monitored gateway. Seasonality remained crucial. Hurricanes threatened ships during specific months. Convoys departed according to weather patterns and naval readiness. The harbor's appearance shifted throughout the year, at times crowded with vessels, at other times comparatively quiet but heavily guarded. As the century progressed, the traditional treasure fleet system began to decline. Changing economic conditions and military pressures altered Spain's ability to maintain rigid convoy structures. Trade gradually diversified. At the same time, broader political transformations were emerging. The American Revolution disrupted British and Spanish colonial arrangements. Later, independence movements across Spanish America fractured the empire's coherence. Havana, once the hinge of a unified Atlantic silver system, began adapting to a new reality. It remained important, but the centralized imperial structure that had defined its 18th century prominence was weakening. When historians describe Havana as the key to the Gulf, they refer to geography. Control of Havana meant influence over maritime routes connecting the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic. But geography alone does not explain the city's power. It was the integration of fortification, fleet coordination, plantation export, administrative oversight, maritime repair infrastructure, seasonal timing. Together, these elements formed a system. By the end of the 1700s, the harbor still opened toward the Atlantic. Cannons still faced outward. Warehouses still lined the docks, but the imperial monopoly that once defined its function was eroding. The harbor did not physically close. The system it served changed. The age of tightly controlled silver convoys gave way to diversified trade. Colonial administration gradually shifted under the pressures of war and reform. Havana transitioned from being the guarded assembly point of treasure fleets to a major sugar exporting port within an evolving global economy. Today, the harbor's shape remains recognizable. Stone fortifications still stand at its entrance, But the 18th century choreography of fleets gathering under cannon protection belongs to a specific historical moment, a moment when Havana functioned as a controlled gateway of empire. Understanding Havana in the 1700s requires seeing it not as a picturesque colonial city, but as a logistical engine embedded within a global imperial system. Its harbor was not only water surrounded by land, it was a mechanism. And when the structure of empire shifted, that mechanism changed with it. If you would like to explore another city that once stood at the center of an empire's network, whether in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, or the Pacific, leave its name in the comments. And if you appreciate historically grounded reconstructions like this, subscribe to follow the next chapter of what history did not write.